Recently, Mike Leger, the executive director of Forestry New Brunswick, an information or propaganda wing of the New Brunswick Forestry cartel, depending on your perspective, made the claim that those documentarians who were showing videos of the many clearcuts of New Brunswick were selectively choosing to show clearcuts over New Brunswick's successful forestry. In his response editorial, called "A Picture is Not Worth 1,000 Words," Mike wrote, and I quote, 23%, soon to be 28% of the 3 million hectares of Crown Forest area will be in conservation because an appropriate amount of old-growth forest, watercourse buffers, and other conservation needs are an important part of forest management. It is an oversight or calculated strategy that these budding documentarians do not report on the 30% hardwood forests that cover our province or the 20% mixed wood forests and the management techniques used to sustain this diverse mixture of forest composition. This is the all-important context that is absent from the 10-minute YouTube variety clip, carefully curated to select one type of forest stand managed for one type of outcome. There are many more outcomes that critics do not want you to see, and definitely they do not want to acknowledge for fear of losing their audience. End quotes. I'm often surprised when persons in the forestry cartel, such as Mike Leger, make such claims, because it really is not hard to substantiate the mess that is the present circumstance of forestry in New Brunswick. Anybody with access to a computer can do it these days, simply by going to Bing Maps or Google Earth and taking a look at satellite imagery. The forests of the entire province are very much scarred, its ecosystems heavily disrupted, and if you live in the province, this is not difficult to see for yourself. Whether in town or country, you'll need travel only a very short distance until you begin to come upon the province's many clearcuts. But there are several problems for the average person in coming to grips with this reality that is true. One is simply that most persons are not skilled in the interpretation of satellite imagery. It's confusing. I remember my early days as an undergrad many years ago studying earth sciences, wrestling with the interpretation of aerial and satellite imagery. It is bizarre and interesting just how different the world from the air can appear if one is not used to it. We humans are largely creatures of two dimensions, used to seeing the world from the ground, and satellite imagery is often simply puzzling. On the simple basis, it's just not how we're used to understanding our world. For those persons who are concerned about the state of forestry in New Brunswick, even if they have access to the landscape from the ground level, understanding it can be puzzling. Every year I teach courses on understanding the landscape, and most persons are quite puzzled by it. With little knowledge of the various flora or fauna species, and how to interpret their activities in the land, it's not as if it's their fault, it's just the way of modern life. Most people these days live urban or suburban lives surrounded by technology. A study conducted not long ago in the UK demonstrated that the average child was more familiar with the aliens presented in sci-fi than they were with the species of animals that lived in the landscape around them. In such a circumstance, it is not difficult to mislead people. Facts, mixed with a little fiction, make a potent combination. For this reason, I have decided to continue using the Microsoft Flight Simulator to survey New Brunswick. And despite Mike Leger's claims that one must choose carefully curated imagery or video to present New Brunswick forestry as the environmental mess that it is, I'm simply going to show you everything the simulator portrays, just as I did in my video entitled The New Brunswick Forestry Apocalypse, which portrayed the landscape between Miramichi and Fredericton. And over the ensuing weeks, we're going to circumnavigate all of New Brunswick and then cross over its interior several times for the sake of thoroughness. The Microsoft Flight Simulator is a tool that's been used by professional pilots and aviation enthusiasts for decades to practice their flying skills. I'm a certified drone pilot and I use drones for videography purposes, and I often use simulators such as the Microsoft Flight Sim for practice purposes. But this flight simulator is something special because it draws the imagery of the world from actual satellite imagery. Thus, it portrays the world as you see it with great accuracy. It's not 100% infallible, but nothing is, and it is amazingly accurate. So roughly 4.5 minutes ago, we took off from the runway in Brockway, located in the southeast of New Brunswick, not too far from the Maine border. And we're going to fly north by northeast to Moncton. And we've just passed over Oromocto Lake, located east to northeast of Brockway, and we'll use the autopilot to fly a straight course to Moncton at a level 3,000 feet. And you can see, as soon as we get across the lake, away from the inhabited areas, the clearcuts begin. And just as we saw in the New Brunswick Forestry Apocalypse, here too, the clearcuts stretch to the horizon. Now this will not always be the case. We'll get into lowland flats later, And as is typical, when we come across villages, we'll see less in the way of landscapes, at least close to areas where people can easily see them. But in the latter portion of the journey, as we get closer to Moncton, we'll also see large areas of devastated forest. However, that will mostly be due to agriculture and urban sprawl. This is a satellite image of the area. The Brockway runway is located on the lower left and indicated by the small airplane-shaped icon. We'll be traveling roughly diagonally across the map in the direction of northeast, in the direction of Sussex, but we'll pass it toward the west. If you look back to the lower left region, about the lower left 20% of the map, you can see a vast region predominated by clearcuts, easily visible from space as shown in the satellite image. It is this region, in fact, that we're flying over now. In fact, satellite imagery shows a watercourse below us, and it portrays that here the clearcutters left a regulation buffer between the clearcut and the watercourse. Many times I've found clearcuts lacking these buffers. So, kudos to them for doing the right thing there. But ahead, as we take an external view from the aircraft, we perceive a landscape riddled with clearcuts as far as the eye can see. There have been claims that the work of a clearcut is similar to that of a forest fire or a blight, and these claims are patently untrue. For one, forest fires reduce the wood into ash, and that ash quickly works its way back into the soil to provide nutrient for new growth, and blight leaves dead trees standing till they eventually tumble to become coarse debris, which will become nutrients for decaying organisms such as fungi, and abodes for organisms which capture nutrient from air and water such as lichens. However, clearcuts simply remove most of the wood from the land, leaving behind what appears to be a blasted, difficult to maneuver landscape of stumps and branches, and a soil that's been depleted, damaged and compacted by the heavy machinery that moved over it to cut and remove the trees, and ultimately subject to erosion and much less able to retain rainwater, making that landscape far more prone to flooding. I talked about this in my previous video, which was a response to Mike Leger called "A Picture May Not Be Worth 1,000 Words, but Facts Are Priceless." But there is much more to the story than that, much more to the devastating reality of clearcutting upon the landscape. One of the many problems with the vast industrial-scale clearcutting that goes on in these Acadian forests has to do with the flattening of biodiversity. For one, a forest is not merely a collection of trees. A forest is a collection of diverse species of trees, and each one of those species has its own ecologic niche and its own strengths and weaknesses. This interweaving of strengths and weaknesses makes a complex ecosystem resilient to change and damage. By way of example, Acadian forests are resistant to forest fires because their populations of deciduous trees are naturally resistant to burning. And because a natural forest is biodiverse, containing many tree species, when a new problem enters the forest ecosystem, such as the spruce beetle or some form of blight, its effects are mitigated because the problem organism will not be able to find the trees that it needs to prey on everywhere. It will need to travel to find new hosts, and that in itself often extinguishes blights and pests. Not to mention that biodiverse forests are mutually supportive. The trees are interconnected through complex webs of fungi beneath the ground, through which they communicate, sharing nutrients and information on how to defend themselves. Such a forest is resistant to pests and blights because when they occur, the various trees work together to fend them off. But the forest industry reduces these biodiverse forests to a few species that they consider valuable, often pines and spruces or eucalyptus. Trees that are selected because they are handy for growing quickly and providing pulp. But these tree plantations are vulnerable. Many of the conifers that the forest industry prefers are filled with a natural pitch, making them inflammable. To see more about this, see my video Firebomb Forest. And as climate change continues to dry the landscape, risks of forest fires fed in particular by these tree plantations will increase. But in terms of blights and pests, these monocrop forests make tempting targets. When a pest that prefers to feed on such trees as conifers is active in a natural forest, it must travel far to find one host and another. But when it arrives in a tree plantation, it finds a vast banquet laid out in front of it. And these pests can do a vast amount of damage very quickly. Now, in the past, there have certainly been incidents when biodiverse natural forests fell victim to pests, though frequently humans played a key role in enabling such events to occur. An excellent illustration of this is the virtual disappearance of the American chestnut tree. These trees were once extremely common throughout much of eastern woodlands, and in some places eastern chestnuts comprised as much as 25% of the tree species. But when Japanese chestnuts were brought to North America, they carried with them a fungus called Cryphonectria parasitica, which was relatively harmless on the Japanese chestnut with which it had co-evolved. But the American chestnut trees had no defenses against it. The fungus found a vast buffet throughout eastern American forests and set to work, and in only a couple generations, this magnificent tree, some of which had trunks over 3 meters in diameter, was virtually extinct. When the forestry industry cuts down a forest and claims that it is okay because it's going to replant the trees, it is important to understand that they have no intent to replant the tree species that were originally there. They have no intent to bring back the original Acadian forests, nor can it exactly be done, but that's a topic for yet another video. Their intent is to replant trees that have a value to their industry, for all intents and purposes to create a monocropped tree plantation. And every time another section of Acadian forest falls, it's pretty much gone forever. It is possible it could grow back, given decades and centuries, but as the biodiversity bank dwindles as more and more of the landscape is clear-cut and converted into tree plantations, it becomes ever more unlikely. But the problems created by the large-scale clear-cutting of forests does not stop there even. A plethora of tree species is essential to the survival of many of the fauna, the birds and mammals and insects and such that live in the forest. One tree may provide a food source, while the next tree provides good nesting. Acadian forests, which are a blend of deciduous and coniferous trees, can take additional steps to support one another. Groups of conifers, when the weather is dry, can emit terpenes into the air. The terpenes rise and act to seed clouds, and thus they can help bring rain to a parched landscape. By contrast, deciduous trees, with their broad leafy boughs, are able to provide more complete shade over the ground, and thus their dense forest canopy reflects sunlight, cooling the forest, and thus trapping water, further ensuring an Acadian forest's ability to resist forest fires. But those broadleaf trees, which are generally considered to be, quote, weed, unquote, trees by the forestry industry, also serve other crucial roles. They are able to move great quantities of water from the ground to the air through a process called transpiration, which effectively refrigerates the landscape beneath their boughs. This is important as many of the species that are acclimated to growing in deep forests require shady, cool, and moist conditions. Those broadleaf trees often provide food in the way of nuts and fruit, leaves, and bark for many browsing mammals, a wide diversity of insects, many of which are pollinators, and the various birds which forage among their trunks and branches. One extremely important thing that these deciduous trees do in keeping the landscape cooler is making a mature forest an ideal habitat for the fungi that are in the soil. When one says fungi, most people think of mushrooms, but those are actually the fruiting bodies of fungi. The actual body of fungi looks more like threads, and these threads, no thicker than the finest hairs, can be found in tremendous abundance all throughout the forest, in the topsoil, if the landscape is undamaged and undisturbed. These fungi are vital for decomposing dead plant and animal matter, returning the nutrients to the soil, and in forming symbiotic connections with the trees, which helps them grow, as well as providing the trees with antimicrobials that helps to defend them from pests. And if we had more healthy forests in the Atlantic provinces, we could have a thriving wild mushroom industry here. By nature, our provinces are rich in edible mushrooms, from the cap and stem fungi that most people think of, such as the boletus, to wild pleurotus, or oysters which grow on the sides of trees, as well as sulfur shells and dryad saddles, and even the extremely valuable underground fungi known as truffles. But all these fungi require stable ecosystems in the form of standing and fallen trees and healthy soil, and as all of the above become more scarce, so does any prospect for a forest farming industry within our provinces, one that is truly renewable, such as harvesting edible mushrooms. But the problems created by the increasing loss of such fungi does not stop there. You, the viewer, may be aware of the struggles that bees are having these days. And one of the reasons bees are having trouble surviving is because they need more than nectar and pollen. Recent studies have shown that at least some species of bees need to feed from those fungal threads called mycelia. Fungi are nature's sources of antifungals and antimicrobials, and it is believed that the bees require this food source in order to activate their own immune systems to protect themselves against pests. I could go on because nature itself is comprised of layer upon layer of complexity. In fact, I don't think that the idea of layers is a great way to describe the complexity within nature. It's more as if nature is comprised of web upon interwoven web upon interwoven web of complexity. And every time another region of forest is clear-cut away, another crucial part of that complexity disappears. Well, we're 15 minutes into this video, and about a third of the way to Moncton, and the satellite imagery, as portrayed through the Microsoft Flight Simulator, still shows a landscape predominated by clear-cuts. However, looking ahead, to the north, we begin to see a river. The St. John River, which flows by Fredericton, and one can see some settlements out there toward the north. And as is typically the case around settlements, one sees less in the way of clear-cuts. People don't like clear-cuts, they're ugly. It's also inconvenient to acknowledge that they exist. But as we look in front of the aircraft, only a few miles ahead, we can see the clear-cuts continue. And this is what we'll continue to see for yet a while longer. In fact, directly ahead, according to the satellite data revealed to us through photogrammetry, we are coming into a vast area of clear-cuts spanning multiple square miles. You can see them here in the satellite imagery, down in the southwest quadrant of this map. The pale, angular areas on the left half of this map represent several recent and vast clear-cuts, each one about 5 kilometers across. And the moderately pale areas in the negative space between the clear-cuts indicates land that was clear-cut sometime in the not-too-distant past. In fact, it looks like sometime between now and the last couple decades, the entire left half of this map has been clear-cut. That's an area spanning roughly 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers, or 400 square kilometers. To be fair to the forestry industry though, the pale areas on the right side of the map do not represent clear-cuts. Those small angular patches with irregularities usually represent private holdings such as farms, businesses, or towns. Though, one could realistically argue that this also represents forest cover loss, in this case not through clear-cutting, but through rural spread and agricultural development. Though in New Brunswick the satellite imagery portrays a pretty clear picture, far and away the major reason for forest loss in New Brunswick is not urban sprawl, rural spread, or agriculture. The major cause of deforestation in New Brunswick is industrial forestry, by an order of magnitude. There are still more problems with clear-cutting a forest, problems which ultimately mean that a clear-cut does not in any way function like natural damage to a forest, such as that caused by a forest fire or a blight. Normally, it takes between 900 and 2,000 years for forest fires to completely recycle regions of Acadian forest, which is to say burn over those entire regions. In Acadian forests, forest fires occur sporadically, just here and there, because biodiverse forests, especially deciduous forests, are resistant to burning. But these modern industrial-scale clear-cuts are so far-reaching and so vast that they reduce the value of those few undisturbed forests that remain. You see, much of the fauna that relies upon forests, mammals, birds, and other creatures, need the forest not just to provide food and habitat, but also cover. Some animals are very much meadow feeders, and they might prefer to dwell near the edges of a forest. But many other animals prefer to dwell deep within a forest. And even if they do prefer to feed in more open parkland woods, or among meadows, they will also travel considerably to get to the good shelter deep within a forest. But as clear-cuts spread, the forest between them becomes smaller and smaller, and those forested regions can become detached from one another. These broken up stands between the clear-cuts become accessible, and more of their area is defined by margins called transition zones. And the deep cover that many animals seek becomes available only in smaller and smaller regions within. So as animals find themselves drawn to concentrate in these ever smaller regions of deep woods, competition grows between the animals. Species seeking forest cover find themselves under greater stress, and humans find it easier and easier to push into these woodlands as they are rendered more accessible by logging roads, and then easier to transit on foot since they're now effectively smaller, allowing hunters and poachers to pressure wildlife everywhere. And this leads to a circumstance where many species have no safe respite, no good shelter, because there just isn't enough in the way of forests offering deep cover. The landscape, their ecosystem, has become a vast patchwork of clear-cuts and half-grown woods with very little in the way of mature woodlands and almost nothing in the way of old-growth woodlands between. And those species come under stress, finding it harder to survive. This is one of the reasons why in today's modern world, Earth has entered into a great extinction event. It's not the first great extinction event, but this one is so clearly caused by human activities such as deforestation, such as clear-cutting, and the innumerable problems they cause, that the cascade of extinctions we are now seeing all around the world has been called the Anthropocene extinction event, meaning definitively that it is caused by humans. So, when forests are broken up and divided by massive industrial-scale clearcuts, the regions that are left intact become less effective at providing shelter simply because they are smaller, and their outer areas become transitional zones, and many woodland creatures would prefer the deeper, heavier, and safer regions of the inner forest, making a forest broken by the process of clear-cutting effectively smaller than it appears to be on the outside. Because of this, when an organization such as Forestry Nova Scotia or Forestry New Brunswick looks at regions of Acadian forest that have been sliced and diced, or checkerboarded into a patchwork of clearcuts and standing woods, those persons trained in the technical craft of forestry might well be sincere when they say, well, we've left a third of the forest standing, so there's habitat for the wildlife. But a person trained in biology, ecology, or a related science looks at that patchwork landscape and sees a region that is smaller than a forester would see, for it is of much less value to the local fauna. But wait, there's more. There's always more, isn't there? Nature is such a complicated, interwoven entity that no matter how much we might think that we understand, every time we look again at the natural world, we discover there are bits and pieces, crucial bits and pieces, that we yet did not know. And in this particular instance, one of the issues at hand is that dividing the landscape into a patchwork of what are effectively microforests of much reduced functionality and ecological value has a way of setting off trophic cascades. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, a trophic cascade is an ecological phenomenon triggered by the addition or removal of top predators and involving reciprocal changes in the relative populations of predators and prey through a food chain, which often results in dramatic changes in ecosystem structure and nutrient cycling. In plainer English, what happens is that when the cover of a forest is effectively reduced by dividing it into a patchwork, so that many smaller forests offer a great deal of transitional zone and very little deep forest area, life becomes harder for those predators that often prefer the cover of deep forests. And not just predators, but larger animals too, a topic we'll come back to later. But animals which used to be common in New Brunswick are gone, extirpated, which is to say entirely wiped out in the region, such as the grey wolf, which, when the colonists arrived, was one of the more widespread top predators in the region. Also extirpated, though in the process of returning, were large cats, such as cougars. These animals are often hated by people and persecuted by hunters and farmers. Fear, based much more on myth than reality, led to the hunting of both grey wolves and cougars, and farmers often pressured the animals because they would occasionally get into their livestock. Our species, as a general rule, doesn't like anything which competes with it. With the grey wolves and the cougars gone, as well as competition from caribou, which also once inhabited New Brunswick, white-tailed deer, a species not native to the area, could move in, and they did, expanding widely and rapidly. And while hunters may have heralded their appearance, they brought problems. For one, white-tailed deer carry a brainworm. For white-tailed deer, this brainworm is virtually harmless, but it is lethal to their cervid cousins, moose. And as the deer expanded, moose picked up the brainworm and began to die out. This was beneficial to the deer, however, because it left more foliage for them to browse. And as their food source increased, so did their numbers. Until once, only a generation or two ago, white-tailed deer were very common in New Brunswick. Hunters enjoyed their abundance, and it was said that a hunter could go out and bag his quota in a weekend. But the surfeit of deer was not so good for the land, as they ranged through meadows and forests. As their numbers grew, suitable forage became scarcer, and the deer pressed ever deeper into woodlands where they might not otherwise have gone. In these deep and shadowed places, they ate young tree saplings, making it much harder for slow-growing deciduous trees to reproduce. And they browsed upon the foliage which grew on the forest floor. Many of these plants are as slow-growing as trees, receiving very little light and compensating by slowing their growth processes. Some, like the spring beauty, photosynthesize only for about a month in early spring before the other foliage comes up. During this brief time, they hurry to bloom and spread their seed, and they are crucial for pollinators coming back after the long winter, providing early sources of nectar and pollen. And in nature, they have very long, slow lives, living up to 20 years. about 98% of that time simply dormant as tubers, lying beneath the ground, awaiting the first warmth of next spring. There is also the American ginseng, highly prized as a medicinal and wants to be found throughout these regions. But it too is a very slow grower and can have a lifespan of centuries. Plants such as these and others fell victim in part to trophic cascades, browsers which had once eschewed the deep forests and stuck with the abundance of meadows and transitional zones, now pressured by lack of food into deep forest regions. And those deep forest regions made ever more accessible by the fact the forest was cut up ever smaller, so that ultimately, between the pressure of clear cutting and the pressure of virtually unchecked deer populations, those deer, which hunters once so much loved, were able to go through much of the New Brunswick forests and cause great damage to the deep forest ecology. The trophic cascade led to the introduction of a new top predator, the coyote, which originated in the American Southwest, but here in the East has hybridized and evolved to become a much larger version of its western counterpart. They preyed on deer. They are much cleverer than wolves, better at evading humans, and they create their own problems for urban areas, occasionally eating pets, and out on farms, occasionally attacking livestock. But they, like the white-tailed deer, are only here because pressures, such as rapid expansion of agriculture and urban areas, and hunting pressure, remove the previous top predators, enabling them to come here. But of all the pressures that have led to their presence, by far and away, the leading one is the deforestation caused by way of clear cutting. But the damage caused by clear cutting does not stop there. Let us return to those slow-growing plants of deep forest shadow, such as the spring beauty and ginseng. For such plants to thrive, especially extremely long-lived plants such as American ginseng, they need reliable forest ecosystems. However, the forestry model involves cutting forests every 40 to 80 years, give or take. And in the scale of a forest lifespan, this is a very short period of time. It takes 80 years or so for a mature forest ecosystem to even begin to come into being. It takes centuries for a mature forest system to evolve into the complexity that defines an old-growth forest. And when the landscape is being cut over every few decades, those organisms which require those long, slow, reliable ecosystems cannot survive. Simply put, one cannot find plants such as American ginseng in a region that is regularly cut over. Perhaps birds might drop a few seeds, but the next time that forest is clear-cut, those plants will simply be gone. Out the windows, we can begin to see some human settlements. Well, we've seen them here and there all throughout this flight, but they're more obvious along the river's bank, where they can easily be discerned by the presence of green, grassy yards, a green that is often distinctly discernible even against the forest, as dark as woodlands, yet brighter in its way. And we can see to the left ahead a twinned highway, and the crossroads that run to various settlements. But notice how small those settlements are, their yards and their meadows, compared to the vast span of the clear cuts all throughout the forest around them. These little communities, whether serving as agricultural regions or simply rural homes, are effectively surrounded by an ocean of clear cuts. This scenario will begin to transition substantially in a little over 11 minutes, when, as we get closer to the substantial city of Moncton, we begin to see much more agriculture and urban sprawl. But the primary cause of the poor health of New Brunswick's forests is definitively clear cutting. And looking out the window on the right here, we see an expanse of what appears to be half a mile to a mile of relatively intact forest, but just ahead, once we get away from the riverside settlements, we see the clear cuts happening again. Anywhere, it would seem that trees are accessible, and the clear cuts can be done mostly out of sight and out of mind. Clear cuts either are happening or have happened. And it is always important to remember that trees as individuals and forests as superorganisms have hugely long lifespans. An average human life, call it 80 years, for many trees is barely out of adolescence. And as it can take as much as 500 years for a mature forest ecosystem to develop. In terms of the way a forest would perceive things, humans barely live through childhood. So when we look below and see forests that are being cut every 40 to 80 years, from the perspective of a healthy forest ecosystem, those regions never develop ecologically. Those regions are never healthy, and many of the species that they support are always under great stress. And while in the scientific world we are only beginning to understand the many complicated relationships that define a forest ecosystem. In fact, it can truly be said that our understanding is only in its infancy. The stress and pressure that this constant chaos of clear-cutting creates for forest ecosystems is evident not just in New Brunswick but throughout the world, as Earth continues to experience the outcomes of the Anthropocene extinction event, and species all around the world vanish. And we in Canada are not immune. For over the last couple centuries, many species have become extinct or extirpated, including the gray wolf, the swift fox, the Canadian lynx, the wolverine, the American marten, the fisher, the black bear, the grizzly bear, the caribou, the pronghorn antelope, the plains bison, the wood bison, the muskox, and the Atlantic walrus. All species extirpated from this province or that due to hunting and harvesting pressure, and especially habitat loss. And species now extinct in Canada include the black-footed ferret, the Vancouver Island wolverine, the eastern elk, the Dawson caribou, the Atlantic gray whale, and the sea mink. And there are many other species presently at risk in New Brunswick. Among fauna, these would include the bald eagle, the harlequin duck, the peregrine falcon, and the piping plover, the maritime ringlet, the Canadian lynx, and the leatherback turtle. Also endangered are a great many plants, for plants cannot outrun clear-cutting. These include the Anacostiaster, the Bathurst aster, Furbish's lousewort, Parker's pipewort, pine drops, prototype quillwort, St. Lawrence aster, and the southern twayblade. Not all of these species are affected directly by clear-cutting and deforestation. In fact, only one of the plants mentioned is. But the pressures created that threaten all these species are ultimately human in origin. And if we are to conserve the species of our world, then we cannot just look at any one piece of the puzzle. We must instead look at the combined effects created by all of our activities and find solutions for all of them together. Clear-cutting and deforestation is a significant piece of the puzzle. It certainly is not the only one, but it is a major piece, and it's not going to go away because addressing it is financially inconvenient. As we look off the portside wing, we can see a number of settlements alongside the river, and some of the plants I just mentioned, such as the Anacostiaster and Furbish's lousewort, are endangered because of riverside degradation. But that is a matter for perhaps another video. The satellite imagery here is relating an area where there is a bit less disturbance to the forest, and I see some meadows and settlements down below and a highway, which explains why clear-cuts are often kept outside areas where they can be readily observed. But if the satellite imagery is correct and being reflected correctly through the photogrammetry that renders the satellite imagery into three-dimensional space so that it can be used for a pilot to practice by way of the flight simulator, then this area has had a few decades to regrow. However, all through the area there are traces of logging roads. Those white lines that you see down below tend to be the dirt paths created by logging roads. If they run straight, often those do indicate logging roads, because it's how the forestry industry will tend to divide up sections of land for cutting and forest management. I'm using the word forest management very lightly, because it's really tree farm management. Actually conserving a functioning forest is not something that's high up on the list of things for the forestry industry to consider. And the imagery does indicate that all of this area has been cut sometime in the past, and if it's crownland and those trees are in fact approaching a size that the pulp industry wants to harvest, you can be pretty certain it'll be cut again sometime in the not too distant future. The GPS is indicating that we are now most of the way toward Moncton, with only about 30 nautical miles, or about 50 kilometers to go. But as we look out ahead of us, we still see a landscape that's heavily predominated by forestry activities. We see roads, farms, human settlements here and there, but all of them live within a sea of clear-cuts and tree farming. Industrial forestry activity is by far the predominating feature of this landscape. And as we are much closer to Moncton than not now, it's time to take a look at satellite image 3. Up toward the top right, which is the northeast, one can see the gray-brown area which represents the city of Moncton. The gray-brown is largely the result of the concrete which represents urban sprawl, and the city is laid out almost like a five-pointed star. We're going to land there in a little over 20 minutes. Right now, our aircraft would be coming into the lower left region of this image, the southwest. and heading up toward the northeast. And you can see laid over the map roads which have been artificially enhanced to make them visible, such as Route 2, the 880, and the 910, the 905, and the 895, and so on. Not shown would be a great many smaller local roads, little streets and byways where people would dwell. Some of those will be suburban dwellings. As we move further and further from the city, those dwellings will take on a more and more rural character. And the dark green that you see between the roadways is forest, and the very pale patches frequently will represent farms and pastures near the city, where the city provides readily accessible markets for their products and transportation for shipping food elsewhere. But whether the land is permanently cleared for urban development, suburban sprawl, or agricultural activities, by definition, the forestry industry considers this type of area to be deforestation, areas which are not intended to regrow trees. In terms of ecology, we would consider deforestation to be anything which removes a forest and damages a landscape for a long period, and that would include massive industrial clear-cutting, even though it's inconvenient for the forestry industry to recognize that reality. But as we get away from the road systems, and in fact, if we imagine that this map is divided in half, roughly from the lower left to the top right, one can see the countless clear patches among the dark green. Much of this represents clear cuts. We may be near to Moncton, but they are out of sight, ergo out of mind. And anything out of sight and out of mind seems to be fair game for the forestry industry in New Brunswick. But remember what we talked about earlier, about how many organisms, from mammals to plants, birds and insects, and many other living things, require the stability and sequestration of deep forest zones. But it's very hard to find any large deep forest zones anywhere on this map. And this map represents a substantial area. It shows us the land from a perspective of over 87 kilometers high, revealing a swath 100 kilometers or more broad. And if you look very closely at this map, you can see that all of that backwoods region up in the northwest half is crisscrossed by faint but visible, straight and revealing lines of logging roads. Insofar as I can see, even this close to Moncton, there is no unbroken forest. The forest that does exist could largely be defined as, at best, transitional zone, making it less than ideal habitat, which those organisms reliant on deep forests will find very stressful, difficult to survive in. And as those innumerable logging roads make it very easy for hunters and poachers to pressure them, anything which might represent game or a trophy animal is going to find it increasingly difficult to survive. In Nova Scotia, this story is reflected by the endangered species, the Nova Scotia mainland moose. It is estimated there remains as few as 200 of these once numerous and magnificent animals, but forestry pressure in their ideal habitats, such as the highlands of northeast mainland Nova Scotia, and the Kejimkujik region around the southwest, has left these animals with very little deep forest stable ecosystem. What remains of their habitat is pretty much definable only as transition zone. An innumerable logging road stretching just everywhere means that these animals come under pressure from poachers every day. They just cannot get far away enough from people to survive, because, narrow though they might be, roads can break up the connectedness of a forest as effectively as a broad swath of clear cut. Thus, the forestry industry of New Brunswick harms the ecosystem not just by way of clear-cutting, but by spreading its logging access roads everywhere. And with the satellite map gone, right out there out the port wing, and just a mile or two back beyond the highway, we can see the vast scars of clear-cuts, once again stretching as far as the eye can see. This is the legacy of the way forestry is done in New Brunswick, a scarred and broken landscape, a profoundly disturbed ecosystem. And contrary to Mike Leger, Executive Director of Forestry New Brunswick's misleading statement, one does not have to carefully curate footage to reveal the expansiveness and virtual omnipresence of New Brunswick's forestry operations. Off our starboard wing, we are beginning to see deforestation of a different kind. Those neatly appearing cleared areas down there represent farms and pastures. And we're going to see more and more of this as we get into our last 30 miles or so as we come into Moncton. In this area, we have more privately held land, and owners are using it for farm and pasture, sometimes just rural dwellings, sometimes other kinds of industrial activities, and sometimes they may even choose to privately log it, and in other cases, let it grow. But as we just now are about to pass over the Trans-Canada Highway, One can see ahead of us more wooded areas, in some places a bit bigger and more unbroken. But in other areas you might notice that there are patches where the trees appear paler. These could be clear-cut areas where the patches represent partial regrowth, or clear-cut areas that have been planted with a different species. I cannot tell you whether this imagery represents industrial operations on crown land or logging operations on private land. What I can tell you is that very often, those pale patches mean the land was at one time or another subject to a clear cut, though it's also possible that some of those clear patches might represent the work of forest fires or blights, taking down groups of trees. The only way to tell would be to get on the ground. However, as we are continuing to pass over the straight traces of logging roads, I would say that the evidence indicates it's a very safe bet that those patches represent logging activity, and the pale patches are either areas in partial regrowth or regions where different species of trees have been planted. In some places, such as just off the starboard wing to behind us, and also to the side and before us, we see irregular open areas that appear neater and longer term. These are often the indicators of farms and meadows. And in many places, as we draw closer still to Moncton, trying to discern whether we're seeing clear cuts or agricultural activity is going to become more difficult. We're going to see the land transition to an agricultural setting over the next few minutes, especially as we're now only about 20 nautical miles out from Moncton. As this happens, we'll see less and less in the way of clear cutting, and very shortly, more and more deforestation as a result of agricultural activities. But though I know I'll sound like a broken record, I want to once again emphasize that while deforestation for agricultural purposes is a major problem in some regions of the world, here in New Brunswick, farms exist, like mere droplets within an ocean of industrial forestry activities, clear-cuts and managed forest everywhere. Though this agricultural region around Moncton might be likened to a puddle, it is very little in the grand scheme of the entire province. And there you can see off the front of the port wing, and off the starboard wing, back into the side, and ahead of us still, the irregular shapes and maintained neat-looking fields that represent farming activities, as well as the acreages, some of which are meadows, around rural dwellings which are not presently engaged in farming activities. I've sailed a lot and I tend to think of aircraft in nautical terms, but just up ahead and off our port bow or off the front left, we see a collection of active farms, also revealed by large meadows, fields, and here and there the large support structures which farms require, barns, and larger buildings to house and maintain the heavy equipment that's used to operate modern farms. Those neat fields down there, cut out of the woods, are so neat in fact that they don't look to me at all like clear cuts, but either areas being freshly opened up to become farming land, or perhaps freshly plowed areas. One of the faults that I find with Microsoft's photogrammetry technology is sometimes it mixes up dates. Presently I have the simulator set to portray the New Brunswick landscape during a clear summer day in late June, but sometimes the Microsoft Flight Simulator will portray little patches of landscape at other times of the year. For example, you might have noticed when we took off the patches of snow lying beneath otherwise green trees. This latest iteration of the Microsoft Flight Simulator has not yet been around for a year, and these are bugs that are still being ironed out, and most likely result from places where the Flight Simulator was working with satellite data from a different time of the year. But as time has gone by, I see fewer of these errors, and by and large the Flight Simulator represents the landscape with great accuracy, whether one is looking at Antarctica, the remote Sahara, or the Amazon, or Atlantic Canada. The landscape usage pattern is beginning to change really dramatically now. Everywhere we look, we're seeing farming fields, meadows, outlying country roads, and just off to the front side of the starboard ring, we can see a small settlement coming into view, one of Moncton's outlying villages. It's actually a pretty landscape in a pastoral sort of way. About a decade back, I spent 6 months in Moncton when I was considering doing postgraduate work at the university. In the end, I decided I missed the wild woods and meadows, where I have lived for much of my life, and decided to return to backwoods homestead living. But as towns go, Moncton was appealing. For a small city, it offered a distinct multicultural flavor, in part French and part English, with persons of other lands dwelling there too, in the typical Canadian fashion of embracing everyone. The outlying countryside of meadows and woods was verdant, lush with the pastures and meadows of farms, and here and there woodlots. But I do remember going for hikes in local parks, and the ugly sight of clearcuts, here and there along almost any drive. The scarred landscape is becoming the legacy of Canada, not just New Brunswick. But we have to take the good with the bad, and there's a lot of beauty in a place like Moncton. And though I am anything but a person who is content to dwell in urban areas, I did enjoy my time there. As one might expect, as we get closer to the city, we're going to see more and more, I hesitate to use the word, but it's the word, developed landscape. I don't like that word developed. It implies that what we humans do with a natural forest ecosystem or any natural landscape is better than what nature itself accomplished. Over hundreds of millions of years, nature develops complex ecosystems that sustain and balance all life. And in a matter of weeks, we humans sweep in and transform those ecosystems into urban and agricultural sprawl, simplifying those ecosystems till they fit only our purposes. And if we compel ourselves to move away from an anthropocentric perspective, that is, seeing the world from what benefits us first, we can see that what we call development is quite the opposite from nature's standpoint. But as we press into the final leg of our journey, we're not far from landing at the Moncton airport. This concept of natural development versus man-made development is relevant to explore. We humans have the ability to survive almost everywhere, but everywhere we go, we tend to disrupt nature's processes, which weakens ecosystems. And this disruption itself often leads to extinctions before things get better. We humans, however, really don't see any of that getting better, as evolution is a process that takes hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So for us, when we weaken a landscape, what was there once before is effectively gone forever. And it is one of the reasons that conservation is so important, so that our children and their children can also know what it is to live in a green and beautiful world. But nature, when left to its own devices, has a way of actually reducing competition and maximizing species diversity. You see, when an environment develops, for example, an environment like the Acadian forest, various species of flora and fauna and fungi move into the region, and at first there is tremendous competition between all these creatures, as they vie for food, shelter, and resources. But the way Darwin thought of evolution and the way the world worked was not entirely correct. Darwin was onto something, but the natural world is not a vicious arena where one organism perpetually competes against the next, everyone invested in self-interest and survival. Nature only reaches such a state when the environment itself reaches apocalyptic conditions. That is, conditions of extreme disruption, where resources such as food, shelter, and water become scarce. Then species will compete aggressively with one another in order to survive, in the same way that we humans would compete among ourselves. Things that can create such an apocalyptic environmental event would be asteroid impacts, massive volcanic eruptions, global warming leading to stagnation of ocean currents, which, as we are seeing these days, leads to dramatic and dangerous changes in the atmosphere. And, as we see in the case of New Brunswick, a vast and almost unimaginable scale of industrial forestry operations. When an environment is so disrupted, species begin to compete against one another. Those species which cannot adapt become extinct, while other species may find a niche they can particularly take advantage of, and overrun ecosystems, at least for a while, till they've used up their resources. But ultimately, one way or another, given a time span that may require tens of thousands to millions of years, ecosystems return to an equilibrium because nature prefers harmonious equilibriums. Thus, before the Acadian forest was grossly disrupted, every organism had its place. Chickadees foraged for insects among tree branches, while sapsuckers adapted to hunting for insects among the trunks of trees. Thereby, the species could coexist without pressuring each other and develop a harmony. And that relationship becomes even more complex when we look at the relationship between the sapsucker and the ruby-throated hummingbird. The hummingbird feeds on the sap released by the sapsucker's activities, but it also protects the sapsucker, doing its best to drive off any competing birds that might approach. And as we explore ever more deeply into ecosystems, we find more and more examples of mutual support between the species that share an environment. Even the relationship between predators such as wolves or coyotes and cervids such as caribou or deer is mutually supportive. The predators preyed upon their sick and the weak, keeping the herds healthy, and they also kept their numbers down, which allowed plant diversity within ecosystems to thrive. And plant diversity protects trees and herbaceous plants against pathogens and pests. It's all mutually supportive. But when this ecosystem is massively disrupted, as we see with the activities of industrial forestry all over New Brunswick, that stability falls to the wayside. Species are forced to fend for themselves in a struggle to survive. And the outcomes, the ecosystem that might evolve from the mess, is unknown. Which is why ecologists say, when you cut a forest, there is no guarantee that the ecosystem that was there before will ever come back. And therefore it is true to say, if an old forest is destroyed, it is gone forever. This is a dilemma that they're having to face out west in Vancouver, and north of there, where the forestry industry has been voraciously cutting down ancient old-growth forests. They have reached a tipping point where there is so little left of the original biodiversity bank that even if those forests were left to regrow for 1,000 years, there is no certainty that the forest as it existed there only a century ago might ever return. And we are seeing similar happen here in the maritime provinces, where our Acadian forests have been disrupted very much by the forestry industry in extremis. Less than 1% of the old-growth Acadian forest remains. That 1% is not all in one place, where it could at least do some good as a biodiversity bank by providing a large region of stable interior forests. No, it is scattered all throughout the maritime provinces. A little patch of a dozen acres here, another patch of a few hundred acres there, very little of it offering any undisturbed inner forest habitat. And so, even in this 1% of remaining Acadian forest, its use and worth as a biodiversity bank is questionable. Thus, while Canada might rightly assert that it is one of the world's great forested nations, it is a broken forest. And with every passing day, it becomes more so, and will continue to do so until the voracious appetites of each of the province's forestry cartels is brought to heel. Urban spread and agriculture do indeed have their impact on our ecosystems, but from what I have seen, from the air, from satellite imagery, and from my own studies on the ground, the true enemy to a stable ecosystem in the Canadian forest is the endless and rampant deforestation that goes on in the guise of so-called sustainable forestry, done largely by clear-cutting through our country's forestry cartels. A reality that is enabled by dysfunctional governments at the provincial and federal levels, dysfunction largely caused by corporate capture, situations in which industry has worked very hard to situate its people in places of power where they can influence policymaking and enforcement. The subject of corporate capture deserves a video in its own right, and it's an area I hope to come back to in the none too distant future. If things are ever going to get better in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and the rest of Canada, it must be addressed. We are just outside of Moncton proper now. You can see the gray of roads and buildings massed up together just ahead of the aircraft, and now zoomed in you can see the airport lights straight ahead of us. And we'll be landing in about 6 minutes. If you would like to see the true state of New Brunswick's forests from the air, continue to follow this channel, because over the next few weeks we'll be using satellite imagery in combination with the Microsoft Flight Simulator to explore the state of forests throughout the entire width and breadth of this province. And as you will see, one need not select, or as Mike Leger put it, carefully curate videos or photographs of New Brunswick forests to find clear cuts. Unfortunately, they are widespread. Unfortunately, it is much harder to find healthy, intact forests than it is to find forest that is either in the process of being cut or has been cut in the none too distant past. In either case, these clear cuts represent a disruption to the forest ecosystem as complete as a super hurricane or extreme earthquake would disrupt an urban environment. The primary difference being that humans tend to quickly rebuild the urban settings they prefer. Nature goes much slower and can require hundreds, if not thousands of years to repair these disruptions. We're now passing over the actual urban area, and you can now see the buildings and even individual homes that define the Moncton and Riverview areas distinctly down below. In fact, those of you who live in the area might recognize your own homes or places of work. That's how accurately the Microsoft Flight Simulator portrays satellite imagery. I know I've tested it, as many others have, flying over the very rural backwoods area where I live to find my own farm, as well as flying over areas representing North and South Nova Scotia to locate the homesteads and farmsteads of friends. Heck, down below right now I see the grocery store where my wife, kids, and I went to shop during our 6 months in that area. As we prepare to turn off the autopilot and drop altitude as we line up on the runway, I want to add a final thought. I am well aware that much of the information I have been sharing portrays a bleak picture. The simple and honest reality is that the forests of New Brunswick are extremely disrupted, the ecosystem effectively being hit by a battering ram over and over again. And as industrial forestry operations have ramped up, the battering ram is hitting harder. Meanwhile, the residents of New Brunswick are forced to subsidize the treatment of their woodlands with herbicides such as glyphosate, and they struggle with a government which has been known to remove people who speak out against it, schools of forestry who have removed professors who have questioned the status quo, doctors who've shown interest in researching the effects of glyphosate on the general populace. It has to paint a truly bleak picture. As I noted in a previous video, I think of myself as a pessimist who would like to be proven wrong. My years in environmental advocacy have created in me a certain cynicism as I see greed push people to willingly deny the harm that they are doing to their own world, the world their friends, family, loved ones, and children and progeny will have to live in. And yet, I like to think that we as human beings can grow beyond this, that we can come to recognize a need to live in balance with our world, to care about all the creatures that share it with us, and to care about each other enough to do the right thing. I'm not naive. I know that forces will work against this. There will always be selfish people who will deny science and compassion for their own reasons, those reasons usually distilling down to money, but portrayed to the public as opportunities for economic advancement and gain for all. But there is no gain that matters in any way whatsoever if we don't have a livable world, and there is no quality of life if this world is deprived of the wondrous variety of its life for a dollar sign. In all the known universe, this is the only world we know of that has complex life, let alone any life at all. Earth is our plan A and our only plan. And I like to believe that at some point, we humans can become mature enough as a species, empathetic enough, caring enough, that we will work together to overcome that baser side of ourselves, that side that thinks in terms only of dollar signs and what we can get for ourselves, and thus work together to bring about a better, kinder, and more universally compassionate world. It is possible, I am certain of it, but bringing about this world will ultimately require that we all as a species rethink how we live, how we derive our power, how we energize our economies, and redefine our lives in a way so profoundly different that as yet we dare barely dream it. I would like to believe that I'm not merely a dreamer, and that a better reality can really someday come about, and the endless fight to save our environment from the forces of greed will one day be able to stop. But whether or not that happens ultimately depends on whether or not we all can come together and demand a better world, and each of us as individuals do our own part to make it happen. Thank you for watching. The Naturalist program is committed to the reliable coverage of natural science and environmental issues. If you like our program, please take a moment to subscribe and like.
Autumn leaves are turning brown, branches bare.